G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. It's Monday. Haven't really done much with the sawmill since Wednesday last week. Basically because cold weather was forecast. Thursday I spent the day producing a bit of ready to split firewood. Friday was too cold to do anything. Saturday was too cold to do anything. Sunday was too cold to do anything. And on Wednesday, I sliced the third quarter into floorboards, which means that on Thursday I had to take the long bar off the saw, configure the saw for firewood, and that means that now before I get back to the sawmilling, I have to change bars on the saw and I have to set it up for sawmilling. And it occurs to me that despite the fact that this will be the 5th video on chainsaw milling, I might as well make a video on changing bars or turning the firewood cutter into a sawmill. This time showing the whole setup. As homegrown and rough as it is, with which I managed to get the whole system to work in order to turn this from something fit to cut firewood into the machine which made these planks last week, as well as these ones, and with which I made a bit of a pig's ear of these ones, only some of which are actually parallelograms. But yeah, given the scale and the standards with which I cobble up buildings, and yeah, every bit of wood you see in here has been made with the same chainsaw. I'm not going to say that last week's work was wasted, because this shed's been standing since 1999. It may be rustic, but it's triangulated and therefore it works. Exceptionally good things are triangles. If you can't triangulate things, then you have to rely on absolute brute strength in order to get things to be strong enough structurally to function. And speaking structurally, one of the worst things you can try to do is to cantilever a load through a single load path out a long way from the strongest structural mounting point. So when I took delivery of the Rip King guide rail chainsaw mill system, and this is it, that's what I got. I got 2 of these guide rails. Now they're 4 feet long. This is British Imperial. It was built 30 years ago. Each one of them has a hole at one end through which this hook bolt secures onto this hefty piece of angle stake. And the idea is that the slide guide goes over the guide rail, and the slide guide, which has a square hole in it, fits onto this square guide rod, which is heftily end butt plate welded onto this mounting block. Now, as you can see, there's one hole provided for the rear mounting stud. There's a slot provided for wherever the second mounting stud might be on whatever chainsaw one might be going to use the thing with. So that's one clever way of adapting to the fact that various manufacturers of chainsaws all pick different dimensions. Another problem is, how do you get this affixed onto here? Well, according to the manufacturer, Saunderson and Coston of Highclere, Shrewsbury, Highclere, Newbury, Berkshire. According to them, you find yourself a couple of castellated studs, which effectively translates as a blind nut with a bit of bolt sticking out the top of it. And you use your castellated studs to hold your regular side plate on, and then you take this thing, sorry about the horrible cinematography there, and you fit it on the top of it, if that makes any kind of sense. So this is going to be sitting on top of your castellated studs, probably an inch away from the chainsaw's guide bar. Then you use the existing nuts on top of your castellated studs up here somewhere and hook that thing on. And the two blokes who had the setup before me, they found that that meant you had way too much of the wobblies, and it discouraged the both of them. Another thing which annoyed them was the extreme physical workload involved in pulling the chainsaw backwards through the tree. So they fixed this extra bar on there with this hole, and the theory was that they were going to work in a team of two, and there was going to be a wire hooked into the hole connected to a hand winch, and there was going to be somebody back at the back end of the log winding the hand winch while the chainsaw operator hung onto the saw, squeezed the trigger, and controlled the angle of the dangle of the bar. And that was the other thing. If you have like an 18-inch or 20-inch bar, you wind up having to cut at an angle steeper than 45 degrees, at which point you are effectively cross-cutting the wood, and it becomes much more energetic procedure, more difficult. The idea is to have the longest possible bar in order to be able to cut at the shallowest angle to a log of a reasonable size, so that you're still ripping the timber away rather than cutting across the grain. But before I figured out the need for a longer bar, I had to figure out that the 026 or 028, whatever it was not a big enough saw to go milling with. And I had to come up with some way of holding that mounting rod directly onto the chain guide bar, like so. But there's no point doing that with the little bar, though I will at this point mention the fact that I had to do a fair bit of sculpting of that mounting plate in order to make a track for the cutters to have sufficient clearance to get past the mounting bar. Not quite entirely sure what that dimple is that's been ground into the centre of it. I didn't do it. I did do the track along there. Which doesn't have much clearance, but it has enough to work. It functions. Right, so first we remove the little firewood bar and we collect the Oregon Miller from its hook where it hangs. We put the big bar onto the saw, set everything up, roughly locate the guide rod, take our carefully crafted pop riveted sheet aluminium sporting bits of road sign type side plate, which I'm sure voids every warranty that's still ever issued. Simply slide it along the guide rod, push it in until the studs poke through, hold it there with your thumb, pick up your oversized double holed custom shaped aluminium washer, which is, as you can see by the black vinyl paint over the top of its reflective coating, also fashioned from a road sign, because recycling is good. Form one planet. So we take our recycled road sign, pop it in place, apply the nuts onto the thread ends, tighten them up, but not so much that you can't wriggle the bar around, because now it's time to tighten the chain. A feat which we will achieve by tightening up that there little screw. So, my method might be as ugly as a hat full of arseholes, so to speak, but it does mean that the mounting of the guide rod is absolutely flush with the cutter bar, so therefore I can get in at least an inch closer to the location of the guide bar. When the slide guide is mounted on the bar, you can imagine if you add the width of the regulation side plate to the depth of the castellated studs, put the guide rod mounting plate on top of the castellated studs, and then, yeah, you'd be winding up probably not being able to cut any closer than that. And you would have much more wobbly wood. So next step before proceeding any further is to examine the cutters, and they do actually require sharpening. All 115 of them. By hand with a file. There we go. Much more betterer. Here's another little refinement. I've ground down the Allen nuts, bolt heads, in order to clear the cutter bar mounting nuts. And here's another little refinement. This thing can obviously go that way on the guide rod, or it can go that way. It would look better if you had the sticker pointing to the outside of the chainsaw. However, you fine tune this thing with a hammer and an anvil to try and get your angles of the dangles exactly precisely correct. And if it really comes down to it, you can fine tune those square holes with a file. And it turns out that with this rig, the only way to cut actually square timber is to have the sticker pointing in. Otherwise, you won't get a parallelogram. And of course, the way you get a bolt head to look like that is by using a little shifting spanner on it, one-handed, for 120 hours. Right, now normally you could do that in less than half an hour, but because I was videoing it, it took nearly an hour. Such is life while trying to make videos on YouTube. So, before getting set up, now the thoroughgoing obsessive compulsive measures the fuel going into the chainsaw mill, just so we know how much it takes. 250, starting from the 200 mark this time. And we used about 90 of that, meaning that Thursday's firewood took 340 mils of motion lotion for 20 minutes to cut the firewood, whereas slicing out those 8 planks on Wednesday took 35 minutes and 575 mils of 2-stroke 50-to-1 mixed chainsaw fuel to cut them out of a pre-existing quarter of a log. That's why it's fun to keep a logbook, eh? So you know what you're doing. And as they reckon, if you can't measure it, then you can't manage it. Or so the truism goes. And if my 372 hours are any guide, you really would have to be a bloody idiot to pay $11 a litre for chainsaw bar oil when second-hand sump oil works just fine. On the biggest bar you can buy in Australia without ordering it specially from Canada. Doing some of the heaviest duty cutting that anybody gets up to with their chainsaw. Full throttle, going backwards, parallel, repeatedly, the long way through a tree. I do seem to recall commencing to explain these guide rails, but I don't think I finished the explanation. As you can see, both of them have a hole in one end for taking the thumb screw hook bolt going onto the angle picket to hold the log upright, stop it from rolling. They're 4 feet long, as I said. They're 2 inches by 1 inch. They're hollow galvanized steel tubes. At the 1 foot mark, in from the ends, you have a bushed hole, and you have a 1 inch by 1 inch spacer. This means that the 2 holes in both bars are exactly 2 feet apart. They're exactly 1 foot in from the end. What this means is you can use this short section of a pipe that's welded into one of the bars to connect another bar over the top. So you can go leapfrogging all your way down a complete tree trunk's length. Not quite as easy as it seems, because if you've got this bar connected to your angle picket, when you work your way all the way down to here, you're then going to find what you need to do is unscrew that bar, pick it up and put it in the holes for this bar. And then what you can do is take this bar and move it down to the next position. It's a pain in the ass, but that's how you have to do it in order to get the holes to line up, because we have this gap. Part of the reason why they've done it that way is so that if you've got a slightly crooked tree, you can adjust for that, because that becomes a flexible joint that holds everything lined up in the vertical sense. And by standing at one end, you can very easily tell by eye if there's any left to right deviation. And you should be following a string line anyway. when you're doing your initial halving and quartering of the log. Depending on the length of your coach bolts, you may on a good day be able to bolt 4 planks together to do one single parallel cut. Other times you might be stretching, and if you persist in that, which I'm going to, it's a good idea to leave the G-clamps on if you can. There's a lot to thunk about. You can use pretty much anything as a straight edge to line those up. Always remembering that the scurf 3/8 wide chainsaw sawdust mark is going to go in precisely 1 inch away from the inner edge of the guide rail. So if the edges are lined up there, and cut away that bevel there, chain has to go through there. And of course, yes, you've got to do all this at the other end as well. Okay, so with that guide rail placed where we want the chainsaw to go, we then take these 3 short coach bolts. See, they're not much shorter, but they are shorter. We place the guide rail that we're actually going to use touching the guide rail that's acting as a depth gauge. At this point, we apply the clamps, all without altering the alignment, to hold the bundle together. Then we take the 2 shortest coach bolts and carefully, maintaining the alignment, we mark the centre holes. For the first 2 coach bolts to be inserted into. Then we remember to change over to a long bolt before snugging them down, and hopefully they'll go all the way through the layup. There we go, one solid block. Right, now we just need to put another one on. As I explained earlier, it's actually pretty easy. Put that thing on there and then come down and look along it, and yeah, that's obviously wrong, and that's obviously wrong too, but yeah, that's just right, in the Goldilocks zone. So quick, before it moves, bash the bastard, thus making your mark. Did, done, there, dat. Hammer in your inch by inch angle bracket and hook bolt it to your guide bar. So we put on the cut-proof Kevlar chainsaw chaps, start the saw and get it running, let it warm up. Can't use it until it's too hot. You put your finger on the cooling fins. If you can touch the cooling fins, I say again, if your chainsaw is so cold that you can touch the cooling fins and hold your finger on them, it's too cold for you to give it full throttle, because they're manufactured with a tapering bore, and it's not until the cylinder heats up that it becomes a parallel cylinder. If you give it full throttle at a high load when it's got a cold cylinder, you will pretty much destroy your saw. So let it warm up first, while you basically go and get your expensive Still professional skid lid. And by the time you get back, it should be about ready. Okay, let's see how we go. Warmed up. There you go. One cut. You might be able to get all of that prepared and change the bar and set the whole thing up and be cutting within 1 hour perhaps. But if you want it done right, you've got to take your time. And these bits of wood that I've cut off, all of them pretty much had to come off because they all come out of this section of the wood here, what they call the heartwood, which is pretty much carroty, has got low tensile strength characteristics. And with this tree, as a consequence of various droughts, pretty much that is the depth of your heartwood that you would have to cut off it if you wanted to get really serious about using the true wood, which is this stuff in here, and that white shit out there is called the sapwood. Right, that sapwood's going to fall off, so you've really only got true wood there. But these are floorboards and it doesn't really matter, so I'm using more of the heartwood than I otherwise should. Alright, so now all I have to do is set that whole thing up again with the furry edges all lined up. This time for the furry edge I'm being a little bit cunning. You can see I've got the narrowest board sandwiched between two wider boards, and that gives me more width in order to get the distance between where the chain's going to go through and where my mounting board's going to go through. And yeah, I figured this one out last week. Not a bad little wrinkle if it works. And it did last time. That's how I made this piece, with no mounting holes. In this case, my little trick of interleaving the narrowest board with wider ones hasn't succeeded in getting it away from the centre line of the bolt holes, but my belief is that holding it in compression like that while drilling has prevented it from splitting. So we shall see what we shall see. I reckon that has got to be, damn the finger trouble. I was going to say that has to be the simplest, lightest, most portable chainsaw mill that anybody's ever come up with. Although, if you have a look at it, that little narrow board, it's not actually parallel, but it wasn't going to be used for a floorboard anyway. It's probably going to get used for making boomerangs. But there you go, that's half the boards out of 1/4. That's the other half of the quarter. And yes, there is an entire quarter yet to be milled. 1/4's waste wood, 2/4's waste wood, 3/4's waste wood so far. And aren't we making a lot of composty, mulchy sawdust to cover up the rocks on the floor of the forest? So all is not lost. It's just time consuming. And as the rednecks do like to say, my bar's bigger than yours. Wobbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao. It must be lunchtime, obviously.